Thank you very much, Mr. Delrahim, for talking to the Voice of America.
Thank you so much for having me.
The Iranian-American community is very proud to see that you have this extremely important position in the Trump administration. When you left Iran, you were 10 years old. Do you remember anything from those times before the Islamic regime?
I do. I remember it vividly. I was 10. I remember the revolution well. I remember the fires late at night. I remember walking in the streets with my dad, seeing protests. I remember it all.
What was Iran like before the revolution started? What are your memories of that?
Beautiful country, a country I would love to visit. And now that I have kids of my own, hopefully have an opportunity in my lifetime to go back and see the country, see the culture. What I remember it, very warm country. Sometimes when I go to the Middle East for work travel, I've been to countries like Egypt or Jordan, Dubai, and I feel that's the very same warmth feeling that I remember as a child in Iran prior to the revolution.
When your family came to the United States, you obviously probably talked about the late Shah's exile and the rise of the Islamic regime. Do you remember anything of those types of conversations or discussions that you had within your family?
Vaguely, I do remember that there was a general belief that the situation during that time was better. I was, I think, too young, and nor did the discussions get in too deep about, the impact or what the, human rights situations were. However, I think more people had greater freedom, educational opportunities, work opportunities, freedom to travel and have exchanges within Europe, in Germany, France, United States. And so they had a lot more of those, I do recall, but we didn't really get into, policies of the Shah and others.
I'm sure you're following closely what's happening inside Iran, these massive anti-government protests around the country. And President Trump has given forcefully his support to the demonstrators. What is your take on that? What do you think? What happened? Where is it going to go?
I think what happened is seems to be a very natural progression of people over a period of time where they don't have the right freedoms, the rights that other people would naturally expect to enjoy. We enjoy it in the United States under our Constitution, which I was fortunate enough to study in my studies. But I think overall, the Iranian people are very intelligent, they're compassionate folks who are also very intellectually curious, at least as much so as anywhere else in the world in my experience. And so they desire that. And I think over nearly 40 years of oppression by the government, they ultimately wanted to, just like they did 7, 8 years ago when there was that uprising at that time. So I think, part of this, it's heartening to watch the Iranian people go through this. You hope for the best at the end of it. Who knows what happens?
Some people are saying that it's a bit different in scope, in geography, and in tone from what happened in 2009, but we have different takes on what's going to happen and so forth, yes.
I think the U.S. administration's response seems to be different. Perhaps technology, development, and access might also be different to allow for that. But it's an exciting time to watch that as somebody who has a desire to go back and experience the culture and the history of the country once again.
We met with Makan Delrahim at the U.S. Department of Justice, where he chairs the Antitrust Division, a position he moved to after serving as Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy White House Counsel appointed by President Trump. According to media reports, Makan Delrahim is the highest-ranking Iranian American in the Trump administration. You represent a highly respected and very courageous Iranian American Jewish community. Can you talk a little bit about the contributions of this community to the United States?
Sure. You know, not only, even a little bit more broadly than the Iranian Jewish community, where a lot of people who, when they hear that I happen to be Jewish and from Iran, are surprised because they don't know there are even Jewish people from Iran or in Iran, even currently. But more broadly, just folks of Iranian descent. Some of the greatest technologies, entrepreneurs, scientists are from Iran. And each time you read about that, you know, it's very easy to get heartened and proud of that. You know, my good friend is the guy who invented the pulse oximeter, who is not Jewish, but also an Iranian immigrant, you know, major company in California. The founder of eBay, Pierre Omidyar, is another wonderful Iranian. The CEO of Uber, another Iranian immigrant. The chief technology officer of Google. A whole host of folks who have contributed so much outside of Iran. That many of these folks would have, you know, are treasures that would have been phenomenal treasures for the country and the people of Iran, you know, had they been there or had the freedom to go back and forth. Within the Jewish community, also similarly proud of the folks who have contributed. I think by and large the Iranian people are dedicated to education, dedicated to, you know, a productive pursuit, and I think you find that amongst a cross-section of all the various religions that used to be generally free prior to this regime to exercise their religions in Iran.
You mentioned education. You also mentioned that you studied constitutional law. Why did you choose to get into law?
I got into law really because of my interest in business. I went to study initially intellectual property law. I became a patent lawyer in the biotech field. I studied the sciences. And that area excited me. In the early 90s, it was really the breakthrough of the biotechnology revolution in genetics and molecular biology. I was excited to see that, and I saw that intellectual property and inventions were a big part. Perhaps that's the entrepreneurial spirit of my Iranian descent factoring in as well. But it was an area, and as I got into it, coming from the sciences rather than from history or studying literature, going to law school, it was a new discipline to learn and read cases. And the structure of the Constitution really excited me. And when I worked in the Senate Judiciary Committee, where we dealt largely with constitutional issues, that's where I probably got much more interested and excited about the history, the structure, and how the government in the United States works.
In one of your interviews also you mentioned that you worked with Orrin Hatch.
Yes.
And President Trump has said that he's had an extraordinary, incredible career. What did you learn from him?
One of the greatest privileges in my life was to be associated with Senator Hatch. I was his chief counsel and chief of staff for the Senate Judiciary Committee when he was the chairman in the early 2000s. I worked for him for a little over 5 years. And just a great man of great integrity. As I think an editorial written by President Obama's advisor, David Axelrod, in CNN was published upon the announcement of Senator Hatch's retirement this past weekend, would point out a great man who reached out to people to express just, you know, a human touch when they're going through a tough time, but not preceding that with a press release. He would do that. I learned, you know, from him just an absolute love of policy, an absolute love of service, public service. I mean, he views himself as a servant to the people rather than the other way around, and that's one of the great things about some of the folks in public service who view their jobs and positions that way.
I want to stay
Sure.
with the public service that you mentioned. There are media reports that call you the highest ranking Iranian American in the Trump administration. But some people might not know that this is your third tour of duty in public service. You also worked in the administration of President Clinton and George W. Bush, right?
Correct.
Okay.
I was on what's called an interagency detail at the Trade Representative's office during President Clinton's tenure at a low level in my mid-20s, helping on the World Trade Organization agreement dealing with the intellectual property chapter. One of my first experiences with that. It was not a political position. It was largely a policy, and I'm largely a policy technocrat more than I am a political operative. So that was one. And then in President George W. Bush's administration came after my service on the Senate staff, and I came to this same division, the antitrust division. I was the deputy for international and appellate in antitrust, and came back last year and did my next tour of duty.
You also worked for the private sector. Some people might not know that, but you worked for top global internet brands like Google. And what happens at Google is that they usually need an open business type of environment to operate. Yet in Iran and China, we see that they're pushing for a closed national interest sort of situation. So does this concern you?
You know, I think any country who tries to limit access, the people's access to technologies that help improve their lives, do that to their own ultimate disadvantage, to the extent they're even successful in doing so, and there's not a workaround. And it's a shame that they do so. I think one of the great successes of the United States is because of its ability to have the freedom, the environment to allow for not only the innovations that are possible, the commerce that is possible, but also the intellectual freedom for folks to express themselves that the First Amendment guarantees. And when countries do that, it's a shame. I would hope it would be different in Iran, and I think the Iranian people would probably demand for it to be different so that they would have the ability to express their views, whatever their views might be.
I also wanted to ask you about the IRGC. It seems that it is, and it's the way that they're controlling some key sectors of the Iranian economy, and it looks like a sort of an artificial monopoly that they have. Some people compare it to that. Do you think that this is harmful to the Iranian economy that is not doing well from what we see with the protests and so forth? What is your take on that? What do you think?
You know, in my personal capacity, and you know, it's not something that touches on the issue of antitrust law, but I do have you know, some personal views. I think again, it's a shame because it limits the ability of the Iranian economy to grow into, you know, the 21st century, where it has not only the intellectual resources and capacity to be one of the great countries, to have some of the best medicine, that in technological innovations in software companies, medical devices, manufacturing, that they should be able to, if they would allow that. And I think, you know, anytime you have limitations on that, I'm sure it's good for some of those folks who are probably doing very well, but really at the cost of the people of Iran.
Thank you very much for your time and talking to the Voice of America.
Thank you so much.